In March of 1857, the highest court in America handed down a decision that would split the nation apart. The case centered on one man's fight for freedom, a fight that had consumed 11 years of his life. His name was Dred Scott, and the Supreme Court's answer to his plea would help light the fuse that exploded into the American Civil War. This is his story. Dred Scott was born into slavery around 1799 in Southampton County, Virginia. He entered this world as someone else's property, just as his parents had been property, just as their parents had been property before them. The Blow family owned him, and like most enslaved people of his time, the exact details of his early life remain largely lost to history. We know he was originally given the name Sam, but when his older brother Dred died, he took that brother's name for himself. It's one of the few personal choices we know he made in those early years. In 1818, when Dred Scott was roughly 19 years old, Peter Blow decided to try his luck elsewhere. The Blow family packed up and moved to Huntsville, Alabama, taking their property with them. That included Dred Scott. Alabama didn't work out the way Peter Blow had hoped. Farming proved unsuccessful, and after about 12 years in 1830, the family moved again. This time they went to St. Louis, Missouri, where Peter Blow opened a boarding house. Missouri was a slave state, admitted to the Union in 1820 under the famous Missouri Compromise, which had attempted to balance the power between slave and free states by drawing a line across the map at the latitude of 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Above that line, in the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase territories, slavery would be banned. Below it, slavery would be permitted. Missouri was the exception, a slave state that dipped slightly above that line. Peter Blow died in 1832. The details here get a bit murky, and historians still debate whether Dred Scott was sold to Dr. John Emerson before or after Blow's death. But what's certain is that Scott ended up as the property of Emerson, a United States Army surgeon, who was about to embark on a series of military postings that would take them both far from St. Louis. Some records from Blow's estate mention an enslaved person named Sam being sold to Emerson, which may well have been Dred Scott under his original name. When Scott learned of this sale, he tried to escape. He managed to evade capture for a while, hiding among other enslaved people in the area, but eventually he was caught in what locals called the Lucas Swamps and brought back. This escape attempt tells us something important. Dred Scott didn't passively accept his fate. Even then, he was looking for a way out. In December of 1833, Dr. Emerson received orders to report to Fort Armstrong in Illinois, near what is now Rock Island. He took Dred Scott with him. Now, here's where things get legally interesting. Illinois was a free state. It had been a free state since 1818, and before that, it was part of the Northwest Territory, where slavery had been prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Dred Scott lived at Fort Armstrong with Dr. Emerson from December of 1833 until May of 1836. For 2.5 years, he lived on free soil. During that entire time, he could have claimed his freedom under Illinois law. He didn't. We don't know why. Perhaps he didn't know he could. Perhaps he had nowhere to go, no support system, no way to survive as a free man in a strange place. Or perhaps he was simply waiting for a better moment that never came. In 1836, Dr. Emerson received new orders. This time he was posted to Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory, in what would later become Minnesota. This was also free territory under the Missouri Compromise, well north of the 3630 line. Dred Scott traveled with Emerson to this remote frontier outpost, where the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers met. Fort Snelling was a military installation in the middle of what was essentially wilderness, a strategic location for controlling trade and relationships with Native American tribes in the region. It was at Fort Snelling that Dred Scott's life took a turn that would prove crucial to everything that followed. He met a young woman named Harriet Robinson. She was about 19 years old, roughly half Scott's age. He was approaching 40. Harriet was enslaved by Lawrence Taliaferro, a federal Indian agent stationed at Fort Snelling. Taliaferro was from Virginia originally, and he'd brought Harriet with him to the frontier, where she worked as a house servant for him and his wife. Dred Scott and Harriet Robinson fell in love. In either 1836 or 1837, they married in a civil ceremony performed by Major Taliaferro himself, who served as a justice of the peace in addition to his role as Indian agent. This was unusual. Most enslaved couples couldn't have legal marriages. They went through informal ceremonies, sometimes called jumping the broom, but these unions had no legal standing. The fact that Lawrence Taliaferro performed an official civil ceremony for Dred and Harriet Scott would later become important evidence in their freedom suits. It suggested that even their enslavers recognized them as something more than mere property. After the wedding, Lawrence Taliaferro transferred ownership of Harriet to Dr. Emerson, so that husband and wife would belong to the same master. They started building a life together at Fort Snelling, as much of a life as enslaved people could build. Dred Scott worked as Dr. Emerson's personal servant, while Harriet performed domestic duties. In April of 1838, despite being pregnant, Harriet had to leave Fort Snelling when Dr. Emerson was transferred yet again, this time to Fort Jessup in Louisiana. The Scotts made the arduous journey south, but they didn't stay long. By September, they were ordered back north. It was during this return trip in October of 1838 that Harriet gave birth to their first daughter on a steamboat called the Gypsy, somewhere north of the Missouri state line on the Mississippi River. They named her Eliza. The location of Eliza's birth wasn't a trivial detail. She was born in free territory, in waters where slavery was prohibited. This geographic fact would become a critical element of their legal case. A Methodist missionary named Alfred Brunson, who happened to be on the same boat, later wrote about witnessing the birth. The steamboat's captain would also testify about it years later. The Scotts returned to Fort Snelling, where they remained for another 2 years. Then, in the summer of 1840, Dr. Emerson received orders to serve in the Seminole War in Florida. Rather than drag his enslaved workers to a war zone, Emerson sent the Scott family back to St. Louis to live with his new wife, Eliza Irene Sanford, whom he'd married while stationed in Louisiana. In St. Louis, the Scotts were hired out to work for other families, and all their wages went to the Emersons. Harriet worked as a laundress and domestic servant, back-breaking work that consumed long hours. Around 1846, she gave birth to their second daughter, whom they named Lizzie. Unlike Eliza, Lizzie was born in Missouri, a slave state. In 1843, Dr. John Emerson died suddenly. His will made no mention of Dred or Harriet Scott, but under the law they became part of his estate, which passed to his widow, Irene Emerson. For the next 3 years, Irene Emerson continued to hire out the Scotts, collecting their earnings while they did the actual work. Neither Dred nor Harriet had any control over their own labor, their own money, or their own lives. By 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott had spent significant portions of their lives living in places where slavery was illegal. Dred had lived at Fort Armstrong in Illinois for nearly 3 years, and at Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory for 4 years. Harriet had lived at Fort Snelling for even longer. Missouri courts had previously ruled in favor of enslaved people who had resided in free territories. In 1836, a woman named Rachel had won her freedom specifically because she had lived at Fort Snelling with her enslaver. The precedent was clear, the legal principle known as once free, always free. Dred Scott tried the simple route first. He offered to purchase freedom for himself and his family from Irene Emerson. He proposed $300. She refused. The reasons for her refusal aren't entirely clear. Perhaps she needed the income from hiring them out. Perhaps she simply believed in her property rights. Whatever her reasoning, she said no, and that left the Scotts with only one option: the courts. On April 6, 1846, Dred and Harriet Scott each filed separate petitions in the St. Louis Circuit Court, suing for their freedom. Their lawyer was Francis Murdoch. Neither Dred nor Harriet could read or write, so they must have had help navigating this legal process. Harriet attended the Second African Baptist Church in St. Louis, where Reverend John R. Anderson served as minister. Anderson had advised other enslaved people on how to pursue freedom suits. The free black community in St. Louis rallied around them. And, crucially, the children of Peter Blow, Dred's original owner, came forward with financial support. Several of the Blow children had turned against slavery in the years since they'd sold Dred Scott, and they agreed to help fund his legal battle. The first trial came in June of 1847. It was dismissed on a technicality. The court allowed them to refile, and 3 years later, in January of 1850, a jury heard the case again. This time, the jury ruled in favor of the Scotts. The court declared that Dred, Harriet, Eliza, and Lizzie had been illegally held as slaves and were now free. For 2 years, they lived as free people while working in St. Louis. But Irene Emerson wasn't finished. She appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court. By this time, her life had changed dramatically. She'd moved to Massachusetts and married Calvin Chaffee, a congressman who was actually an outspoken abolitionist. Irene transferred the legal battle to her brother, John Sanford, who lived in New York. In 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision. In a stunning break from decades of precedent, the court ruled that the Scotts should remain enslaved. The opinion written by the Missouri Supreme Court reflected the changing politics of the time. The judge who wrote it essentially said that Missouri would no longer free enslaved people just because they'd lived in free territory. The court criticized its own earlier decisions and declared that those rulings had been wrong. Times had changed, the judge wrote, and the agitation from abolitionists in the North had made Missouri less inclined to cooperate on the slavery question. This was politics masquerading as jurisprudence, and it meant that Dred and Harriet Scott, who had tasted freedom for 2 years, were suddenly enslaved again. The Scotts could have given up. They'd been fighting for 6 years already. They'd won once, only to have victory snatched away. But they didn't give up. With new lawyers and continued support from the Blow family, they pressed forward. Because John Sanford lived in New York and was now the defendant, the case could be filed in federal court under diversity jurisdiction, meaning it involved parties from different states. In 1854, the case reached the United States Circuit Court in Missouri. The court ruled against Scott, upholding the Missouri Supreme Court's decision. That left only one avenue of appeal. The Supreme Court of the United States. The Scott's lawyer, Roswell Field, convinced Montgomery Blair, a prominent attorney who would later serve in President Lincoln's cabinet, to argue the case before the highest court in the land. By this time, the case had become national news. The slavery question had consumed American politics. The Missouri Compromise had been partially undone by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide the slavery question for themselves through popular sovereignty. Kansas had descended into violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. The Whig Party had collapsed, and a new political party, the Republicans, had formed explicitly to stop the spread of slavery into the territories. The entire nation was watching as the Supreme Court prepared to rule on Dred Scott's case. The Supreme Court heard arguments in February of 1856. Then the justices sat on the case for an entire year. Behind the scenes, President-elect James Buchanan was secretly communicating with Supreme Court justices, trying to influence their decision. Buchanan wanted the court to settle the slavery question once and for all, to take it out of the political arena. He even pressured Justice Robert Greer, a fellow Pennsylvanian, to join the Southern justices in the majority. This interference with the sitting court was highly improper, a scandal that would only come to light later. On March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the court's opinion. It was one of the longest decisions in Supreme Court history up to that point, filling more than 200 pages in the United States reports. All 9 justices wrote opinions, but Taney's majority opinion was the one that would echo through history. The decision was catastrophic for Dred Scott and for Black Americans everywhere. Taney ruled that people of African descent, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. The Constitution, Taney claimed, had never intended to include black people when it spoke of citizens. He wrote that black people had been regarded as beings of an inferior order, so inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Therefore, Dred Scott had no standing to sue in federal court in the first place. The case should have been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. But Taney didn't stop there. He went further, addressing the substance of the case even though, by his own logic, the court had no jurisdiction to hear it. He ruled that Scott's residence in free territory had not made him free, because enslaved people were property, and the Fifth Amendment protected property rights. Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories, Taney declared, which meant the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. Every law that had attempted to restrict slavery's expansion was suddenly null and void. 2 justices, John McLean and Benjamin Curtis, wrote powerful dissenting opinions. They argued that Taney had gotten the history wrong, the law wrong, and the Constitution wrong. Curtis pointed out that free black men had voted in several states when the Constitution was ratified, which meant the founders clearly considered them citizens. He argued that the majority opinion was reaching far beyond what was necessary to decide the case, essentially making political pronouncements under the guise of legal reasoning. The nation exploded in outrage. In the North, the decision confirmed abolitionists' worst fears about what they called the slave power, a conspiracy of Southern plantation owners who controlled the federal government. Newspapers denounced the ruling. Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery and become one of the nation's most powerful voices for abolition, called it a vile and shocking abomination. Republican politicians saw their worst suspicions confirmed. The Supreme Court, dominated by justices from slave states or appointed by pro-slavery presidents, had essentially declared that slavery could spread anywhere in the country, that no territory could ban it, and that black people had no rights at all. In the South, the decision was celebrated. Pro-slavery politicians and newspapers praised Taney for standing up to Northern aggression. They saw the ruling as a complete vindication of their position. Slavery was constitutionally protected, they argued, and the abolitionists had been put in their place. The political consequences were immediate and profound. The decision made the Republican Party stronger, not weaker. If the Supreme Court was going to declare that slavery could expand into every territory, then Republicans would fight even harder to change the court. A young lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who had been making a name for himself in Republican circles, delivered a speech in response to the decision. He called it a dangerous political heresy and argued that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. In 1858, Lincoln ran for Senate against Stephen Douglas, the powerful Democratic senator who had championed popular sovereignty. Their debates became legendary. In 7 face-to-face confrontations across Illinois, Lincoln and Douglas argued about slavery, the Dred Scott decision, and the future of the nation. Douglas tried to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Supreme Court's ruling, arguing that territories could still effectively ban slavery by refusing to pass laws protecting it. Lincoln attacked this logic as nonsensical and accused Douglas of being part of a conspiracy to nationalize slavery. Lincoln lost that Senate race, but the debates made him a national figure and positioned him for a run at the presidency 2 years later. The Republican Party's platform in 1860 explicitly repudiated the Dred Scott decision, calling it a subversion of the Constitution. When Lincoln won the presidency without receiving a single electoral vote from the South, Southern states began to secede. South Carolina left the Union less than 2 months after the election. Within a few months, 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America. In April of 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. But what happened to Dred Scott himself? Ironically, he never benefited from the Supreme Court decision that bore his name. By the time the court ruled against him, Irene Emerson's circumstances had changed yet again. Her husband, the abolitionist Congressman Calvin Chaffee, was horrified to discover that his wife still owned the most infamous enslaved person in America. The publicity was a disaster for his political career. To solve the problem, Chaffee arranged for Irene to transfer ownership of the Scott family back to the Blow family in St. Louis. On May 26, 1857, just under 3 months after the Supreme Court had ruled that he could never be free and could never be a citizen, Taylor Blow, the son of Dred's original owner, formally freed Dred, Harriet, Eliza, and Lizzie Scott. After 11 years of legal battles, after 2 trials, multiple appeals, and a Supreme Court case that shook the nation, Dred Scott was finally free. He found work as a porter at Barnum's Hotel in St. Louis. He became something of a celebrity. People knew his face from the engravings that had appeared in newspapers. For 16 months, he lived as a free man in the city where he'd spent so much of his life. He worked, he supported his family, and he walked the streets without fear of being sold or separated from his wife and daughters. On September 17, 1858, Dred Scott died of tuberculosis. He was about 59 years old. He was buried in St. Louis. He'd been free for barely a year and a half, a fraction of the 11 years he'd spent fighting for that freedom. He never lived to see the Civil War. He never saw the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment that finally abolished slavery throughout the United States. He never saw the 14th Amendment that overturned the Supreme Court's ruling and declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens, regardless of race. Harriet Scott outlived her husband by 18 years. She worked as a laundress and lived to see the Civil War tear the country apart and then stitch it back together. She lived to see slavery abolished. She lived to see her people become citizens in the eyes of the law. She died on June 17, 1876, exactly 1 month before the nation's centennial celebration. She was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in St. Louis, one of the first burial grounds for black residents of the city. What should we make of Dred Scott's legacy? The Supreme Court decision that bears his name is widely considered the worst ruling in the court's history. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, writing decades later, called it a self-inflicted wound from which the court took generations to recover. Legal scholars point to it as the most egregious example of the judiciary trying to impose a legal solution on what was fundamentally a political and moral problem. The decision didn't settle anything. It didn't calm tensions or preserve the Union as James Buchanan had hoped. Instead, it accelerated the nation's slide toward war. But the failure of the Dred Scott decision wasn't really about Dred Scott the man. It was about a nation that had built itself on slavery while proclaiming that all men are created equal. It was about a constitution that had embedded protections for slavery while avoiding the word itself, as if not naming it would make it less real. It was about political leaders who kept trying to compromise on an issue that was fundamentally incompatible with compromise. You can't be half-free. You can't construct a moral framework where some people are fully human and others are property depending on which side of an arbitrary line you happen to stand on. Roger Taney thought he could settle the slavery question by declaring it beyond political debate, by making it a constitutional fact that Congress could not ban slavery, and that black people could never be citizens. He thought he could use the authority of the Supreme Court to end the argument. Instead, he proved that some arguments can't be ended by judicial fiat. Some moral questions have to be fought out, sometimes literally, before they can be resolved. The Dred Scott decision radicalized moderates. People who had been willing to tolerate slavery where it existed but wanted to limit its spread now saw that limiting it might not be possible within the existing constitutional framework. The decision gave enormous energy to the abolitionist movement and to the Republican Party. It made Abraham Lincoln a national figure. It helped elect him president. And his election triggered secession, which triggered war, which ultimately destroyed slavery root and branch. In one of history's great ironies, the Supreme Court decision that declared Dred Scott could never be free and could never be a citizen helped create the political conditions that would eventually free 4 million enslaved people and make them all citizens. Taney's attempt to use law to entrench slavery forever helped provoke the war that ended slavery for good. Dred Scott himself was an ordinary man thrust into extraordinary circumstances. He wasn't a revolutionary. He didn't lead a rebellion or publish manifestos. He simply wanted what every person wants: freedom for himself and his family. He wanted to own his own labor, make his own choices, and live without fear that his wife and children could be sold away from him. When the legal route to purchasing his freedom was blocked, he turned to the courts, and he persisted for 11 years through defeat after defeat. His lawsuit wasn't unusual for the time. Historians have discovered that hundreds of enslaved people filed freedom suits in the decades before the Civil War. Most of these cases are forgotten now, but they show that enslaved people were constantly pushing against the boundaries of their bondage, using every tool available to them, including the legal system that generally regarded them as property. Dred Scott's case became famous not because he was unique, but because it reached the Supreme Court at exactly the wrong moment, when the slavery question had become the central issue in American politics, and when the court's decision would have maximum impact. We should remember Harriet Robinson Scott as well. The case was originally Dred Scott and Harriet Scott, two separate lawsuits that were later combined under Dred's name. Harriet had just as much claim to freedom as her husband. She had lived at Fort Snelling for years. Her daughter Eliza had been born in free territory. But because the cases were combined under Dred's name, history has largely forgotten Harriet's role. She was a full partner in the fight for freedom, not just a supporting character in her husband's story. Think about what Harriet and Dred Scott endured. 11 years of legal battles, winning once, only to have it taken away. Watching their case become a national spectacle. Living through the uncertainty of not knowing whether they would remain enslaved or gain freedom. Raising two daughters in bondage, knowing those children could be sold at any moment. And through it all, continuing to fight, continuing to press their case, continuing to believe that justice might eventually prevail. When we talk about the Dred Scott decision today, we usually talk about constitutional law and political history. We talk about Chief Justice Taney's opinion and its impact on the coming of the Civil War. All of that is important. But we should also talk about the human beings at the center of it. We should talk about a middle-aged couple who fell in love on the frontier, who got married in a civil ceremony that recognized their union as something real, who had children together, and who spent more than a decade fighting through the courts for the simple right to be free. The Dred Scott decision tells us something important about the limits of law. The Constitution is not self-interpreting. It doesn't have inherent meaning independent of the people who read it and apply it. Roger Taney read the Constitution one way, based on his assumptions about race and his commitment to protecting slavery. Justices McLean and Curtis read it differently. Abraham Lincoln read it differently. The men who wrote the 14th Amendment read it differently. The document itself couldn't settle the question because the question wasn't really legal. It was moral and political. Slavery ended not because courts ruled against it, but because people fought against it, sometimes in courtrooms, and sometimes on battlefields. It ended because enslaved people like Dred and Harriet Scott refused to accept their status as property. It ended because abolitionists kept agitating despite being told to be quiet and accept compromise. It ended because Republicans made opposing slavery's expansion their central political platform. It ended because Union soldiers died to preserve a nation that would ultimately be transformed by the war they fought. And it ended because constitutional amendments were passed that explicitly overturned the Dred Scott decision and everything it stood for. Visit St. Louis today, and you can see reminders of Dred Scott's story. There's a marker at the old courthouse where his case was tried. He's been inducted into the St. Louis Walk of Fame. His grave in Calvary Cemetery has a headstone, and next to it is a cenotaph for Harriet, whose actual gravesite was discovered years later in a different cemetery. The old courthouse itself, now part of the Gateway Arch National Park, preserves the history of freedom suits in St. Louis and tells the story of the hundreds of people who, like the Scotts, used the legal system to fight for their liberty. The Dred Scott decision stands as a reminder that the Supreme Court is not infallible. 9 justices in black robes don't have special access to truth or justice. They're human beings with their own biases and assumptions, operating within their own historical moment. When 7 of those justices came from slaveholding families or were appointed by pro-slavery presidents, their decision reflected those origins. The worst Supreme Court decisions happen when justices confuse their own preferences for constitutional requirements, when they read the law through the lens of their prejudices and call the result inevitable. But Dred Scott's story also reminds us that even failed legal battles can change the world. He lost his Supreme Court case. The decision went entirely against him. Yet that decision helped trigger a political realignment that brought Lincoln to power and ultimately destroyed the entire system of slavery. Sometimes losing a battle is necessary to win the war. Sometimes the outrage provoked by an unjust decision creates the political will to change the system itself. Dred Scott fought for freedom and won, at least briefly, before it was snatched away, and then won again just before his death. His case helped bring about a war that freed millions. The constitutional amendments passed after that war overturned the decision that bore his name and extended citizenship to all persons born in the United States. In the long arc of history, Dred Scott's fight mattered. It mattered because he made it, because he persisted, because he refused to accept that he and his family should remain enslaved when they'd lived on free soil. In the end, Dred Scott was a man who wanted to be free, who found every legal door closed in his face, who had the highest court in the land declare that he had no rights, which white men were bound to respect, and who nevertheless gained his freedom and lived to enjoy it, if only for 16 months. That's worth remembering. The case is worth studying for its legal and political importance, but the man is worth remembering for his humanity, his persistence, and his refusal to stop fighting even when the odds were stacked impossibly high against him.